Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through gilded doors into a world of powdered wigs, towering hairdos, and an alarming amount of cake, or so the legend goes. We're talking about Marie Antoinette, the most famous queen France ever had, which is saying something, because France had a lot of queens and a spectacular habit of making their lives miserable. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuinely warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and honestly, your taste is impeccable. Comments like yours are what keep this channel growing, and I mean that. Don't forget, we're now live on Spotify too, so if you want to drift off to the sound of 18th century chaos on your commute or in bed, the link is down in the description. Now, dim those lights, flip on a fan, pull your blanket up to your chin, and get comfortable, because tonight we are going somewhere very, very expensive. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to be Marie Antoinette? Did she genuinely eat cake for breakfast, or was that someone else's problem? What did she do all day in a palace so large that people got lost in it for hours? Did she have friends, or just people who smiled at her because they had to? Did she ever get a single moment alone in her entire life? Or was there always someone watching, judging, and writing it down? Was she really the frivolous airhead history made her out to be? Or was she something far more complicated? A teenager thrown into an impossible situation and handed a crown before she could handle a conversation. And did she ever, even once, actually say the thing about the cake? Congratulations, you have just woken up in the Palace of Versailles. The year is 1770. You are 14 years old. You don't speak the language fluently. Your husband is a stranger, and approximately 3,000 people are waiting to watch you eat breakfast. Growing up as the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria sounds like it should come with some kind of survivor's badge. You were born on November 2nd, 1755, into the Habsburg dynasty, the most powerful royal family in Europe, which sounds glamorous until you realize that being 15th means you are basically a diplomatic spare part, charming, presentable, and quietly being prepared for the day someone needs to cement an alliance with a foreign power. Your childhood home is the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, and while it is undeniably magnificent, it is also, by the standards of most childhoods, completely overwhelming. Maria Theresa runs her court like a general runs an army, efficiently, strictly, and with absolutely no tolerance for dawdling. Your mother is not a warm woman, at least not in the way you might hope a mother to be. She is an empress first, a strategist second, and a parent somewhere further down the list. She loves her children, this much seems clear from her correspondence, but love, in her vocabulary, is expressed through arranging your future, critiquing your posture, and writing you extremely detailed letters about your moral failings once you have been shipped off to another country. She has 16 children in total, and she manages each of them the way a chess player manages pieces, with purpose, with foresight, and with a clear sense of which ones are most valuable on which squares of the board. The Hofburg Palace itself is the kind of place that sounds wonderful in a sentence, and is slightly exhausting to actually live in. There are hundreds of rooms. There are formal dinners. There are ceremonies that require specific clothing and specific behavior and a specific expression that communicates deference without communicating weakness. You learn these things early, not because anyone sits you down and explains them, but because the court simply expects them, the way it expects the sun to rise and the footman to stand still. Failure to comply is not punished with anger, it is noted, quietly, and added to a running mental tally that powerful people keep about you for the rest of your life. As a younger child, you have a certain freedom that the older siblings do not. There are simply too many of you for everyone to be watched constantly. You play in the palace gardens. You are apparently charming. Visitors remark on it repeatedly. That particular Viennese charm that is equal parts genuine warmth and trained performance. And at this age it is impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. You have a quick laugh and an easy manner that will serve you well in the formal world you are being prepared for. What you do not have, yet, is the education to match it. By the time you are 7 or 8, lessons have become more structured, more urgent. There are dancing masters, because a Habsburg princess must move beautifully. There are music tutors, because the harpsichord is a social necessity. There is French, because French is the language of European power, and you will need it wherever you are eventually sent. There is, notably, less emphasis on reading, writing, history, and the kind of rigorous intellectual training your mother applies to the education of her sons. This will matter later, more than anyone at this point seems to realize. There is one person who shapes these years more gently than most, your father, Emperor Francis I, who dies when you are 9 years old. By all accounts, he is warmer than your mother, more inclined to laughter, more willing to simply be present with his children rather than directing them. His death is a genuine grief, felt across the entire household, and it leaves your mother harder and your childhood a little quieter than it was before. You are 9 years old. You do not know yet that childhood is nearly over, but the letters from foreign courts are already beginning to arrive. Here is something that the history books tend to gloss over. Marie Antoinette, future Queen of France, was not particularly well educated. This was not entirely her fault. The Austrian court's approach to educating its archduchesses was, to put it charitably, a work in progress. Emphasis on the work, very little on the progress. Tutors came and went. Languages were taught inconsistently. She could sing pleasantly, dance with grace, and play the harpsichord well enough to impress a dinner party. What she could not do, at least not fluently by the time she left Vienna, was write a polished letter in French without making errors that would make a Parisian wince. The issue was partly structural and partly personal. Structurally, the Habsburg court did not consider a thorough academic education particularly important for its daughters. Sons were educated for governance, languages, law, military history, the mechanics of power. Daughters were educated for marriage, languages, music, dancing, needlework, and the specific social skills required to be pleasant and appropriate in any court in Europe. It was an efficient system if your goal was producing agreeable wives for foreign monarchs. It was a less efficient system if your goal was producing a woman capable of navigating the most politically treacherous court in the Western world. Personally, the young Archduchess was not, by temperament, a natural student. She was social, energetic, easily distracted, and far more interested in people than in books. She could charm a tutor into spending the lesson in conversation rather than grammar, and she frequently did. Her mother received reports about this with an increasing level of irritation. The letters Maria Theresa sent to her daughter throughout her life, and she sent many, return again and again to the theme of application, of effort, of the danger of idleness. They are the letters of a woman who can see exactly where the gaps are and cannot quite understand why they have not been filled. One tutor, the Abbé de Vermond, was sent from France specifically to improve her French and her general education in preparation for the marriage. He found her charming, naturally intelligent, and constitutionally resistant to sitting still long enough to finish a lesson. He reported back to Versailles that she was quick to understand but slow to apply herself, which is a diplomatic way of saying that she was clever enough to learn but had not yet been given a compelling reason to do so. He persisted, and she improved, but the foundation remained uneven. What she did learn, she learned thoroughly. Her French became functional and then fluent, though her spelling and grammar remained imperfect in ways that she was self-conscious about for the rest of her life. She developed a genuine love of music, not just as performance but as pleasure, and it was one of the few intellectual pursuits that stayed with her through the upheavals ahead. She had taste, genuine taste, in art and architecture and fashion, and taste is its own kind of intelligence, though it is rarely credited as such. The real cost of this incomplete education was not social. She could hold a conversation with anyone, but political. She arrived in France without the analytical tools to read the court she was entering, without the historical knowledge to understand the forces shaping it, and without the writing skills to communicate effectively when communication became urgent. In a world where a carefully composed letter could change an alliance, and a poorly chosen word could start a war, this mattered enormously. She would spend the rest of her life learning lessons that should have been taught in Vienna, and learning them, as she would discover, the hard way. The betrothal of Marie Antoinette to the Dauphin of France, the heir to the French throne, was arranged the way most things in the 18th century were arranged between great powers, not with affection, but with calculation. France and Austria had been traditional enemies for generations, rivals who had spent centuries making each other's lives difficult across contested borders and trade routes. And then, in a move that surprised nearly everyone, they decided to make peace, or at least to gesture in that direction, by marrying their children to each other. You are 11 years old when this arrangement is essentially settled. The alliance between France and Austria, the diplomatic revolution of 1756, as historians would later call it, had reshuffled the entire map of European power. Maria Theresa needed France as a counterweight to the rising power of Prussia under Frederick the Great, who had already helped himself to a significant piece of Austrian territory and showed no signs of developing a conscience about it. France needed a stable Eastern partner. The marriage of their respective heirs was the seal on the arrangement, the human guarantee that the alliance would hold. Marie Antoinette was, in the language of diplomacy, an instrument of state. This is not a metaphor. This is how it was described at the time. Her mother prepared her for this role with a mixture of genuine affection and breathtaking pragmatism. Maria Theresa loved her daughter and simultaneously had absolutely no hesitation about dispatching her to a foreign country at 14 to marry a stranger in service of Austrian foreign policy. These two things were not in her mind in conflict. This was simply the reality of royal life, and preparing her daughter for it was the most useful thing she could do. The alternative, keeping her home, educating her for a life she would never have, would have been the genuinely unkind option. The French court, for its part, inspected the young Archduchess's credentials with the thoroughness of people evaluating a significant investment. Reports came back from Vienna about her appearance. Pleasant, potentially beautiful, her manner, charming, lively, and her health, good. No obvious obstacles to producing children. The Dauphin's grandfather, Louis XV, approved. The ministers approved. The arrangement moved forward with the smooth efficiency of a transaction in which everyone involved is satisfied except the two people whose lives are being arranged, neither of whom has been asked. For the young Archduchess herself, the prospect of becoming Queen of France was not, initially, a source of dread. France was the most powerful, most glamorous, most culturally influential kingdom in Europe. Versailles was famous everywhere. To be its queen was to occupy the most visible throne in the world. There was excitement in this, real excitement, the kind that comes before you understand what the thing actually costs. She was 11, then 12, then 13, being polished and prepared and parcelled up for France, and the reality of what was coming. The homesickness, the loneliness, the fishbowl life under thousands of watchful eyes was not yet imaginable. That education was still ahead of her. France would provide it. In the spring of 1770, Marie Antoinette left Austria in a procession that stretched for miles, a cavalcade of carriages, horses, ladies-in-waiting, and luggage that represented an entire life being packed up and shipped across a continent. She was 14. She would never see her mother again in person. The journey itself took weeks, winding through the European countryside toward the French border, and it was deliberately theatrical. This was diplomacy on wheels, a public display of the alliance being forged between two empires. Crowds gathered along the route to catch a glimpse of the young Archduchess who was about to become French. The departure from Vienna was, by all accounts, genuinely emotional. Maria Theresa wept, which was unusual enough that people noted it. The younger children cried. Even the court, which had known this day was coming for years, seemed to feel the weight of it in a way that the formal language of official dispatches could not quite capture. Marie Antoinette herself was composed in public and, reportedly, less composed in private. She was leaving everything she had ever known: her language, her home, her family, her country, the particular smell of the Hofburg in winter, and the sound of Vienna on a summer evening. She was 14 years old and she was not coming back. The procession moved through Bavaria, through towns that had been alerted in advance to prepare appropriate welcomes. Bells rang, crowds gathered, officials delivered speeches. Marie Antoinette smiled from the carriage window with the trained graciousness of a girl who had been taught to perform warmth at a distance and was now performing it across an entire continent. She was already, in a sense, becoming the thing she would be for the rest of her life, a figure in a window, observed by people who thought they knew her. The journey was long enough to feel the distance accumulating. Each day's travel put more miles between her and everything familiar. The language in the towns they passed through shifted. The architecture changed. The faces of the people lining the roads looked different. Her Austrian ladies who had accompanied her this far grew quieter as the French border approached, knowing that their time with her was almost over. She had been told what would happen at the crossing. She had been prepared for it. Knowing a thing in advance does not, as it turns out, make it easier. Her mother's final instructions, delivered in writing because Maria Theresa understood that advice given in the moment of departure is quickly forgotten, covered everything from religious observance to political conduct to the maintenance of a pleasant expression under difficult circumstances. They were, in their way, a masterclass in survival in a foreign court, written by a woman who had survived several. Read them now, and they feel almost unbearably poignant. A mother sending her daughter into a world she cannot protect her from, offering the only armor she has, words on paper, instructions for a situation she will face alone. At the French border, the Austrian part of the journey ended, the French part began, and the girl who had been Maria Antonia, Archduchess of Austria, stepped across a line drawn on a map and became, at least in name, someone new. Before Marie Antoinette could officially become French, she had to stop being Austrian, at least symbolically, and by symbolically, the 18th century meant it quite literally. On a small island in the Rhine River near Strasbourg, a ceremony was staged that was, when you really think about it, one of the stranger diplomatic rituals in European history. A pavilion had been built specifically for the occasion, divided down the middle by a line marking the border between France and Austria. Marie Antoinette walked in on the Austrian side with her retinue, her ladies, her dogs, her personal belongings, and then, one by one, they were all taken from her. The Austrian ladies who had accompanied her from Vienna said their farewells here. The Austrian servants who had travelled with her were returned across the border. Her personal belongings were examined, and those deemed insufficiently French were replaced. Even her clothing, the Austrian garments she had worn for the journey, was exchanged for French ones. The message was not subtle. You are no longer Austrian. You are French now. France will provide everything you need. What you brought with you was for the journey. It ends here. There is something almost clinical about this ceremony that becomes more unsettling the longer you think about it. It was not designed to be cruel. It was standard diplomatic protocol for royal brides crossing between kingdoms. But the effect of it, on a 14-year-old girl who had just travelled for weeks away from everyone she had ever loved, was to make the finality of her situation absolutely concrete. There was no path back. The people who knew her, the language she dreamed in, the familiar faces of her childhood, all of it was now on the other side of that line, and she was not going to cross it again. Her dog, reportedly, was among the things she was not permitted to keep. Whether this is entirely accurate or somewhat embellished by later accounts is unclear, but it has the ring of truth about it, because it is exactly the kind of specific, small cruelty that bureaucratic thoroughness produces without intending to. Someone with a list of regulations, checking items off, not thinking about what it means to be 14, and suddenly without even that small comfort. What she received in exchange was a French household, French ladies in waiting, French servants, French clothing, a French identity being pressed onto her like a seal into warm wax. The Comtesse de Noailles, appointed as her chief lady-in-waiting, greeted her on the French side of the pavilion and immediately began explaining protocol. The Comtesse was famously rigid about etiquette. Marie Antoinette would later nickname her Madame Etiquette, which gives you a fairly clear sense of their relationship, and she began her duties before the girl had time to compose herself. Strasbourg received her with tremendous celebration. fireworks, illuminations, crowds pressing forward to see the new Dauphine of France. She smiled, she waved, she performed the role she had been trained to perform. And somewhere inside the performance, a 14-year-old girl was doing the math on what had just happened to her life and finding the numbers extremely difficult to balance. The moment Marie Antoinette first met her future husband, Louis Auguste, Dauphin of France, was not, by most accounts, the stuff of fairy tales. He was 15, stocky, and painfully shy, the kind of shy that manifests not as quiet charm, but as an almost total inability to hold eye contact or produce a sentence that wasn't about hunting or locksmithing, which were, genuinely, his two great passions. She was 14, polished, trained in the art of courtly conversation, and had been preparing for this moment for months. He reportedly said very little. She reportedly smiled through it. The court watched with the intensity of people who had nothing better to do, which, at Versailles, was everyone. Louis Auguste was not what anyone would have called a natural heir to the most glamorous throne in Europe. He was intelligent, genuinely, substantively intelligent, with a particular gift for mechanics, languages, and geography. But his intelligence expressed itself privately, in books and workshops and long solitary hours spent at his locksmith's forge, rather than publicly, in the salons and levees and theatrical performances of court life where French royalty was expected to shine. He had been raised by a grandfather who found him disappointing, and courtiers who found him awkward, and this had not improved his confidence. What he felt when he met his future wife is not entirely clear, because Louis Auguste was not a man who expressed his feelings in ways that were easily observed or recorded. He was polite. He was not unkind. He simply had very little idea what to do with a lively, charming, socially adept 14-year-old girl who had just arrived from Vienna expecting, if not romance exactly, at least something warmer than silence. The wedding was days away. They barely knew each other's names. The court watched this first meeting with the consuming interest it brought to all royal interactions, and the verdict was mixed. She was charming. Everyone agreed on that. He was awkward. Everyone agreed on that too. Whether they would find their way to each other was the question, and the court, which had been waiting for a Dauphine for years and had opinions about everything, had opinions about this as well. The fact that their opinions were recorded, circulated, and discussed in the salons of Paris within days of the meeting gives you some sense of the environment Marie Antoinette was entering. She handled it with more grace than most adults could have managed. She was warm with him, genuinely warm, not performatively so, and patient with his silences in a way that suggested either good instincts or excellent training, possibly both. She wrote to her mother that he seemed kind. This was generous. It was also, by most accounts, accurate. Louis was not glamorous, not charismatic, not the romantic figure a young girl might have hoped for. But he was not cruel, not vicious, not indifferent to her in the way that would have made the marriage genuinely unbearable. He was simply a very shy young man who had been handed an enormous amount of responsibility and a new wife in the same week, and was managing both about equally well. They would spend 7 years figuring each other out, stumbling toward a marriage that was, in its strange way, genuine, before the weight of the world they were born into made everything else irrelevant. The wedding of Marie Antoinette and the Dauphin Louis Auguste on May 16, 1770, was by almost every measure an extraordinary event. Extraordinary in its scale, its expense, its symbolism, and, in the way that Versailles almost inevitably managed, its capacity for things to go quietly wrong in the middle of a spectacle. The ceremony itself was held in the royal chapel at Versailles, which seated an impressive number of France's most powerful nobles, all of them dressed in their finest, all of them watching with that particular expression the French aristocracy had perfected over centuries, politely attentive, privately judgmental. Marie Antoinette wore a white and silver gown of extraordinary richness, encrusted with diamonds and embroidered with a precision that represented weeks of work by some of the finest craftspeople in France. She was, by all accounts, beautiful in it, small, fair, with the particular luminous quality that 14-year-old girls sometimes have before the world has had time to wear it down. Louis wore cloth of gold. The chapel was filled with flowers and candlelight and the rustle of several thousand people who had been standing for hours and were quietly developing opinions about the seating arrangements. The ceremony itself went smoothly enough. The signatures required by both religious and civil protocol were obtained. Louis's hand shook when he signed, producing a signature that was later noted as somewhat unsteady, a detail that historians have perhaps overinterpreted, but which is at least consistent with the character of a deeply nervous 15-year-old signing his name to his entire future. Marie Antoinette's signature was, reportedly, neater. Make of that what you will. What followed the ceremony was a banquet of imperial proportions, and then fireworks, magnificent fireworks, planned for months, expected by the thousands of ordinary people who had gathered outside the palace gates for a glimpse of the celebrations. And then the thunderstorm arrived. A sudden, violent summer storm swept across Versailles, cancelling the fireworks and sending the crowds running for shelter. It was widely interpreted as an omen. The French had a gift for interpreting weather as an omen, especially when royalty was involved. The fireworks were rescheduled, and a week of festivities followed. Balls, theatre performances, elaborate suppers, and the endless ceremonial processing of two young people through a series of events designed to announce their union to the world. The public celebrations in Paris drew enormous crowds, and here the festivity turned genuinely dark. In the Place Louis XV, what is now the Place de la Concorde, a location that would become significant in Marie Antoinette's story in ways too heavy to mention yet, the celebrations became a disaster. A panic in the crowd, caused by the fireworks display and the press of bodies in a confined space, resulted in a stampede. Dozens of people were killed. Some accounts say more than 100. Marie Antoinette, when she heard what had happened, reportedly wept and insisted on sending her personal savings to the families of the victims, a gesture both genuine and politically shrewd. Though at 14 it is fair to assume the politics were not yet her primary motivation, the crowd that had cheered her arrival was already, in the cruelest possible way, providing a preview of what was coming. To understand what Marie Antoinette's daily life was like at Versailles, you first need to understand what Versailles actually was, because it was not simply a very large and expensive house. It was, in the most literal sense, a machine for controlling the French aristocracy. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had built it as a deliberate trap, by requiring France's most powerful nobles to live at court, to compete for proximity to the king, to spend their fortunes on clothes and entertainments and gifts. He ensured that they were too busy, too broke, and too far from their home territories to actually threaten him. It was a masterpiece of political engineering disguised as a palace. By the time Marie Antoinette arrived, Versailles housed somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people, depending on how you counted and what time of year it was. The palace itself was enormous. The Hall of Mirrors alone stretches for nearly a quarter of a mile, but enormous does not mean comfortable. The main royal apartments were grand but drafty. The heating was inadequate for the size of the spaces. In winter, wine reportedly froze on the dinner table during formal meals. In summer, the smell from the inadequate sanitation system was described by visitors in terms that suggest they were working very hard to be diplomatic. The courtiers who lived at Versailles did not, for the most part, live in the main palace. They inhabited apartments carved out of the building's wings and outbuildings, sometimes single rooms, sometimes a suite of rooms depending on rank, and these ranged from merely cramped to genuinely squalid. The stairwells smelled, the corridors were crowded at all hours. People conducted private business, personal arguments, and occasional romantic liaisons in full view of anyone who happened to be passing. Privacy at Versailles was a concept that existed mainly in theory. For Marie Antoinette, the lack of privacy was total. As Dauphine and then Queen, she had no moment that was not observed, no conversation that was not noted, no expression that was not interpreted. The ladies-in-waiting who attended her were not merely servants. They were members of powerful, noble families, with their own interests, their own alliances, and their own channels of communication back to the people who were interested in what she said and did. Saying something unguarded in front of a lady in waiting was roughly equivalent to saying it in the middle of a busy Paris street, except that the audience was smaller and the memory was longer. She adapted to this, because adaptation was the only option available. She learned to perform composure. She learned to say very little of substance in public. She learned the specific art of being pleasant to people she distrusted, which is an art that Versailles had been teaching people for 100 years and had refined to a very high level. What she did not learn quickly enough, what perhaps no one could have taught her, was how to stop the performance from becoming the whole of her existence. The palace itself was extraordinary. She could see that. The gardens, the gilded rooms, the sheer impossible scale of the thing. And there was genuine pleasure in it, at least at first. But pleasure and comfort are not the same thing, and Versailles delivered one while quietly withholding the other. It was a golden cage in the most complete sense. Beautiful, admired, impossible to leave, and cold in ways that had nothing to do with the heating. Every morning at Versailles began with a ceremony so elaborate, so rigidly choreographed, and so fundamentally bizarre by any reasonable standard that it deserves its own category of human experience. The lever, from the French word for rising, was the ritual awakening of the royal family, and it was not private, it was not quiet, it was not, by any stretch of the imagination, relaxing. Marie Antoinette was entitled by protocol to be attended during her morning routine by a procession of ladies in waiting, ranked in precise order of nobility, each of whom had specific duties to perform, and these duties could not be delegated, reassigned, or skipped without causing a diplomatic incident. The getting dressed ceremony was organized around the principle that every task involved in preparing the queen for the day was an honor, a coveted privilege that noble families competed for and would have been genuinely offended to lose. Handing the queen her chemise was a privilege. Fastening her gown was a privilege. Presenting her with her stockings was a privilege. These things sound like jokes, but they were not. They were the currency of a court that had turned proximity to power into the most valuable commodity available, and the morning ceremony was where that currency was distributed. The mechanics worked as follows. Ladies ranked in descending order of nobility, each had specific roles to perform, and if a higher-ranking lady arrived in the room, while a lower-ranking one was in the middle of performing her function, the duty was interrupted and passed upward. This meant that if Marie Antoinette was in the middle of being dressed and a duchess of higher rank than the current attendant walked in, everyone paused, reshuffled, and transferred the chemise or the stocking or whatever piece of clothing was currently in play to the more senior pair of hands. The queen stood in the middle of all this in various stages of undress, waiting, while the nobles sorted themselves out. Marie Antoinette found this maddening. This is documented. There are accounts of her standing, half-dressed, watching the ladies in waiting perform their elaborate handoff of her own clothing, and laughing, sometimes genuinely, sometimes the slightly desperate laugh of a person who has realized that this is simply what mornings are going to be like for the rest of her life. She could not speed it up. She could not simplify it. The protocol was older than she was, more powerful than she was, and completely indifferent to whether she was cold or tired or simply wanted to get dressed without an audience. The hair came after the dressing, and the hair was its own production. In the early years at Versailles, the styles were already elaborate. As Marie Antoinette became queen and her influence over fashion grew, they became extraordinary. Structures of wire and padding, and real hair and false hair and powder and ornament that took an hour or more to construct and required a specialist to produce. The court watched this too. The morning was essentially a performance, and the getting dressed ceremony was the opening act. By the time she was actually dressed, had received the day's initial reports, and was ready to face the formal business of the morning, which might include another ceremony, or a procession, or the receiving of petitioners, several hours had passed. The day had not yet started, and she was already exhausted in the specific way that comes from being watched continuously since the moment you opened your eyes. Welcome to Versailles. Every morning, the same. There is no sleeping in when you are the Queen of France, and there is definitely no getting dressed in peace. If you wanted to design the perfect environment for rumor, jealousy, and social warfare, you would build something that looked very much like the court of Versailles. Thousands of people living in close proximity, all competing for the favor of one family, all bored enough and ambitious enough to spend their considerable free time observing, whispering, and recording every detail of everyone else's behavior. This was the world Marie Antoinette arrived into at 14, and it was watching her from the moment she stepped through the gates. The court's relationship with its new Dauphine was complicated from the beginning. The factions were already established before she arrived. Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry, held enormous informal power, and Marie Antoinette, instructed by her mother, by Austrian diplomats, by everyone with an interest in the Franco-Austrian alliance, was expected to be polite to her. Being polite to a royal mistress was not, in the abstract, a complicated thing. In practice, at Versailles, where every interaction was observed and interpreted and filed away for future reference, it was a minefield. Refusing to speak to Madame du Barry was read as Austrian arrogance. Speaking to her too warmly was read as approving of a system of royal favoritism that offended various parties for various reasons. The young Dauphine navigated this badly at first. She was stubborn about it in the way that 14-year-olds are stubborn, not strategically, but on principle, with a teenager's conviction that the right thing should be possible to do and that doing the wrong thing for political reasons was a kind of dishonesty. Her mother's letters on this subject are increasingly frustrated. Eventually, under enormous pressure from Vienna, she spoke to Madame du Barry, said something pleasant and inconsequential, and the court erupted in discussion of this event as though it were a treaty negotiation, which in a sense it was. This was the texture of daily life at Versailles. Everything meant something. Every seating arrangement at dinner was a statement about relative standing. Every public conversation was assessed for evidence of alliance or hostility. Every smile, every snub, every few minutes spent speaking with one person rather than another was fed into the court's endless processing of social information, producing outputs in the form of gossip, speculation, and occasionally formal complaints to the king. Marie Antoinette developed her own circle, young, lively, fashionable, and this circle became both a genuine source of pleasure and a genuine political liability. Her closest friend at court was the Princesse de Lamballe, gentle and devoted. Later came the Comtesse de Polignac, whose entire family would benefit extravagantly from the royal favour. The court watched these friendships with an uncharitable eye, noting the gifts, the appointments, the money that flowed toward the Queen's favourites, and adding it to the mental ledger it was keeping against her. In a place where nothing was private and everyone was watching, even genuine friendship looked like patronage, and patronage looked like corruption, and corruption looked like evidence of everything her enemies already believed about her. She never stopped being watched. She never found, within the walls of Versailles, anything that could honestly be called safety. The court was beautiful, powerful, and completely merciless, and she had arrived in it at 14 with an incomplete education, a shy husband, and no one in the building she could fully trust. That she survived it as long as she did, and maintained as much dignity as she did, is not a small thing. For the first 7 years of their marriage, Louis and Marie Antoinette did not consummate their union, and the entire court of France, and indeed most of Europe, knew about it, discussed it constantly, speculated about it endlessly, and made it everyone's business except the two people most directly affected. This is one of those facts about the 18th century that sounds almost too strange to be true, until you remember that in this world, royal fertility was a matter of state policy, and the inability to produce an heir was not a private problem, it was a political crisis. The reasons have been debated by historians ever since, and the honest answer is that the full picture remains somewhat unclear. Louis appears to have had a physical condition, likely a relatively minor one, possibly correctable, that made consummation painful or difficult. Whether it required a small surgical procedure, as some accounts suggest, or resolved on its own, as others indicate, is still argued. What is less disputed is that for 7 years the marriage existed in a state of uncomfortable suspension, and that this suspension was known, discussed, and weaponized by everyone at court who had any reason to wish the young couple ill, which was quite a lot of people. Marie Antoinette's position during these years was genuinely precarious. A Dauphine who produced no children was a Dauphine who could, theoretically, be sent back to Austria, the marriage annulled, the alliance renegotiated, the whole expensive diplomatic arrangement unwound. She understood this. Her mother, whose letters never let her forget it, understood this. The Austrian ambassador at Versailles understood this and reported on the situation with a regularity that suggests he was significantly more invested in the state of the royal marriage than any ambassador reasonably should be. What is striking, looking at this period, is how she handled it. She did not retreat into misery, or at least not visibly. She filled the time with the things available to her: court entertainments, music, riding, card games, that went rather too late into the night and cost rather more money than was entirely sensible. She built friendships, developed her famous taste for fashion, and became increasingly central to the social life of Versailles in ways that had nothing to do with her official function as a future mother of heirs. She was, in the language of a later century, distracting herself. In the language of the 18th century, she was failing to behave with appropriate queenly gravity, and the court was noting it down. Louis, for his part, seems to have experienced these years with a mixture of genuine fondness for his wife and profound awkwardness about the situation they were both in. He was not cold to her. He was not unkind. He was simply a young man with a problem he could not discuss openly, married to a young woman everyone was watching for signs of pregnancy, living in a fishbowl the size of a palace. If this sounds like a recipe for emotional distance, it was. The resolution came eventually, helped along, reportedly, by the intervention of Marie Antoinette's brother, Emperor Joseph II, who visited Versailles in 1777 and had what must have been an extraordinarily candid conversation with his brother-in-law about the situation. Whatever was said or done, the marriage was consummated shortly after. Marie Antoinette became pregnant the following year. The court celebrated with the particular relief of people who have been anxious for a very long time and are extremely glad to have something else to think about. 7 years of silence, speculation, and diplomatic anxiety, resolved by a brother-in-law's visit and a conversation that no one recorded and everyone would have very much liked to hear. If there is one image that has survived from Marie Antoinette's reign more than any other, more than the diamonds, the palace, the revolution, it is the hair. Those extraordinary, gravity-defying towers of powdered curls, feathers, ribbons, and in at least one famous case, a model ship balanced on top of a woman's head with the structural ambition of a small building. And while Marie Antoinette did not invent the fashion for elaborate hairstyles, she elevated it, commissioned it, and wore it with a flair that made her the most watched, most copied, and most commented upon woman in Europe. Her dressmaker, Rose Bertin, was not so much a seamstress as an artist, an architect of fabric. Rose Bertin arrived in Marie Antoinette's life sometime in the mid-1770s, and the effect was immediate and permanent. She was not noble, not courtly, not the kind of person who would normally have had regular access to the Queen of France, but she had something more valuable than a title. She had genius. Her creations were unlike anything the court had seen. Gowns in colours that had not yet been named. Embroidery so intricate it required magnification to fully appreciate. Silks sourced from Lyon's finest workshops and cut in ways that seemed to defy the normal relationship between fabric and the human body. Marie Antoinette wore them, and the court fell over itself trying to keep up. The hairstyles reached heights, literally, that became a period of their own. The coiffures of the 1770s were engineered structures built over wireframes and pads, supplemented with false hair, powdered white or grey, and then decorated with whatever the wearer wished to communicate about herself that particular evening. Feathers were popular, ribbons were universal. Miniature scenes, tiny landscapes, Small models of ships, representations of recent events, appeared on the most extravagant examples. One famous style commemorated a French naval victory with a model warship in full sail, balanced above the wearer's head with an optimism that physics did not entirely support. Doorways became a genuine logistical challenge. Carriages required renegotiation. Women learned to sit at angles and enter rooms sideways. The practicalities were absurd, and everyone knew they were absurd, and no one stopped, because at Versailles the impractical had always been the point. The point was not comfort. The point was display, the visible, undeniable, expensive display of status, taste, and proximity to the queen whose style everyone was following. The bill for all of this was enormous. Marie Antoinette's clothing expenditure was genuinely staggering. Thousands of livres annually on gowns alone, further thousands on accessories, ribbons, shoes, fans. She had a dress delivered every week, following a ritual in which swatches of fabric were mounted on cards and presented to her each morning for selection. She is said to have been easily bored by this process, making choices quickly and then forgetting about them, which is perhaps the most relatable thing about her entire reign. The fashion, though, was not purely personal indulgence. It was also economic. The Lyon silk industry, which employed thousands of French workers, depended significantly on royal patronage, and Marie Antoinette's appetite for silk kept looms running. It was also political, in the way that all display at Versailles was political. A queen who set the standard for taste and style was a queen who was watched, followed, and to some degree admired. The problem was that admiration and resentment are not mutually exclusive, and as France's finances deteriorated and ordinary people's lives became harder, the image of a queen spending fortunes on feathered hairstyles became something considerably more dangerous than a fashion choice. Sometime around 1774, Marie Antoinette was given something that no woman in her position had really been given before in quite this way, a space that was genuinely, entirely her own. The Petit Trianon was a small, exquisite neoclassical chateau within the grounds of Versailles, built originally for Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour. Louis XVI gifted it to his wife, and Marie Antoinette proceeded to transform it into the closest thing she would ever have to a private life. She redesigned the gardens in the English style, romantic, wandering, deliberately informal, a pointed contrast to the rigid geometry of Versailles' grand, formal parterres. The Petit Trianon was small by royal standards, which is to say it was the size of a large country house rather than the size of a small city, but its scale was part of its appeal. After the vast, echoing, perpetually observed machinery of the main palace, a building where the rooms were merely large rather than theatrical felt almost intimate. Marie Antoinette furnished it according to her own taste, lighter, more delicate than the heavy grandeur of Versailles proper, and established a rule that would become legendary and, in certain quarters, notorious. No one entered the Petit Trianon without her personal invitation, not courtiers, not ministers, not even, on occasion, the king. This rule was, by the standards of Versailles, revolutionary. The entire premise of court life was that proximity to the royal family was a right that could be earned, competed for, and maintained, that the nobility had a claim on the presence of their monarchs that was not merely social but quasi-constitutional. For the Queen to establish a space where she simply declined to be observed was a direct challenge to this premise, and the court received it as such. Those who were invited to the Petit Trianon, her inner circle, her closest friends, were the object of intense envy. Those who were not invited were the object of something more interesting. They were offended. The offended parties did what offended parties at Versailles always did. They talked. The Petit Trianon became, in the court's imagination and then in the wider public's imagination, a place of mysterious and presumably scandalous goings-on. What exactly was the Queen doing there, without the court watching? The pamphlets that were already beginning to circulate against her took enthusiastic note of the private retreat and supplied answers that ranged from implausible to completely invented. None of it was true. What she was actually doing was hosting small suppers, putting on amateur theatrical performances with her friends, walking in the gardens, and experiencing, for the first time in her adult life, something approaching a private afternoon. The gardens she created around the Petit Trianon are still, in their restored form, extraordinarily beautiful winding paths, artificial hills, a small lake, a grotto, a temple of love on a little island. She had a theatre built, where she performed herself, taking speaking and singing roles in the productions with an enthusiasm that the more traditional members of the court found undignified, and the rest found charming. This was the Marie Antoinette that her friends described: warm, funny, genuinely playful, capable of laughing at herself in ways that the public performance of queenship never allowed. The Petit Trianon did not change who she was in public, but it preserved something of who she was in private, for just a little while longer. Among the gardens of the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette built a hamlet, an actual hamlet, a cluster of thatched roof cottages, a working farm, a mill, a dairy, a tower, and a dovecote, all arranged around a small pond to create the impression of a charming rural village. This is the detail that has fueled more mockery of Marie Antoinette than almost anything else about her life, because the optics are, admittedly, not great. The Queen of France, surrounded by a country increasingly hungry and resentful, building herself a pretend farm where she could dress in simple muslin and watch actual working farmers farm, while actual working farmers across France could barely eat. The Hameau de la Reine, completed in 1783, was designed by the architect Richard Meek and cost an amount of money that the court and the pamphlets were both extremely happy to publicize. It was, in purely aesthetic terms, lovely. Thatched roofs over solid stone construction, roses climbing the walls, ducks on the pond, real cows in the dairy, producing real milk that real dairy maids churned into real butter. The farm actually functioned. It was not a stage set with painted vegetables. It was an operational small farm, maintained by actual agricultural workers, producing actual food, on the grounds of one of the most expensive palaces in the world. The context in which this needs to be understood is that pastoral fantasy was, in the 1780s, a fashionable intellectual trend among the European aristocracy, an expression of Rousseau-influenced ideas about nature, simplicity, and the corruption of excessive civilization. The English aristocracy had been building picturesque hermitages, fake ruins, and model villages on their estates for decades. The Hameau was not, in this sense, uniquely strange. It was, however, uniquely visible, because Marie Antoinette was uniquely visible, and everything she did was processed through a lens of suspicion and resentment that had been building for years. She genuinely enjoyed it. This is worth saying clearly. The Hameau was not purely a political statement or a fashionable affectation. She spent real time there, walked the paths, visited the dairy, wore the simple muslin dresses that were their own kind of expensive, and found in the controlled, artificial simplicity something that the real world, in all its complexity and danger, could not give her. The irony is complete and almost unbearable. A woman trapped by the most excessive court in Europe, seeking relief in a fantasy of ordinary life, while the ordinary people of France were seeking relief from lives she could not have imagined. Whether she understood this irony is the question that history cannot fully answer. She was not stupid, and she was not without compassion. The record of her private charities and personal kindnesses is extensive. But Versailles had built a wall between the royal family and the reality of France so thick, so complete, and so long-standing, that it is difficult to know how much of ordinary French life she could actually perceive. The Hameau was not a symptom of indifference so much as ignorance. The ignorance of a woman who had been raised and then imprisoned in a world where want was invisible and extravagance was the baseline. It is not a flattering distinction, but it is an honest one. On May 10th, 1774, Louis XV died of smallpox, and overnight Marie Antoinette, not yet 19 years old, became Queen of France. By all accounts, both she and her husband were terrified. Louis reportedly fell to his knees with her and said, God guide us and protect us. We are too young to reign. It was one of the more honest things a new monarch has ever said upon accession, and it was, unfortunately, entirely accurate. France in 1774 was not a simple inheritance. The country was deeply in debt, the tax system was broken, the gap between the nobility and everyone else was widening with every passing year, and the philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment was busy providing ordinary people with the intellectual vocabulary to articulate exactly how angry they were. Louis XVI was 20 years old, cautious, fundamentally decent, and temperamentally unsuited to the kind of decisive, authoritative kingship that the moment required. He was not a bad man, historians have largely agreed on this, but he was an uncertain one, prone to delay, uncomfortable with confrontation, and genuinely unsure how to navigate the competing pressures of a court full of nobles with incompatible interests, and a country full of people whose patience was running low. He wanted to reform. He genuinely did. He appointed capable ministers, considered serious proposals, and understood, at least intellectually, that change was necessary. Then he hesitated, reversed himself, and appointed different ministers, and the window for reform began to close. Marie Antoinette, for her part, embraced queenship with a mixture of genuine excitement and dawning anxiety. The excitement was understandable. She was 19. She was queen of the most powerful country in Europe, and the constraints of the Dauphine years were at least partially lifted. She moved into the Queen's apartments at Versailles, established her own household, and began exercising a degree of influence over appointments and favours that she had not previously been able to. She also began spending more freely, as though the crown had removed whatever residual inhibition about expenditure she had previously maintained. The anxiety came from the same source as the excitement. She was queen, and she was 19, and France was complicated in ways that no one had really prepared her for. Her mother's letters, which continued with their characteristic mixture of affection and instruction, urged caution, restraint, and political attentiveness. Marie Antoinette read them, agreed with them in principle, and then went to another late-night card game. This pattern, understanding the advice, not quite following it, would continue for years. The French public's initial response to their new queen was cautiously warm. She was young and pretty and not associated with the excesses of Louis XV's court in the way that her predecessor, the Dauphine, who never became queen, might have been. There was goodwill available, genuine goodwill, in the first years of the new reign. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette's story is partly the tragedy of watching that goodwill evaporate, slowly at first, then, with increasing speed, as the years passed and the problems of France deepened, and the image of the Queen that was circulating in the pamphlets became further and further from whatever the truth actually was. When Marie Antoinette finally gave birth to her first child in December of 1778, a daughter, Marie Thérèse, nicknamed Madame Royale, France exhaled with a mixture of relief and mild disappointment. Relief that the Queen was capable of bearing children at all, after 7 years of anxious waiting and humiliating speculation. Mild disappointment because it was a girl, and France wanted a son, an heir to the Bourbon throne, a dauphin, a future king. The birth had been a near disaster in itself. Protocol dictated that the royal birth be observed by members of the court, and so many people crowded into the chamber that Marie Antoinette nearly fainted from the heat and the press of bodies. This detail, the birth observed by a crowd, is one of those 18th century facts that requires a moment to fully absorb. The Queen of France giving birth was not a private medical event. It was a semi-public ceremony attended by members of the royal family, high-ranking nobles, court officials, and anyone else with a claim to witness it, because the legitimacy of the heir required witnesses. The logic was politically sound and humanly grotesque. Marie Antoinette, in the middle of labour, was surrounded by people in formal court dress, pressed so tightly against each other that the air in the room became unbreathable. When she lost consciousness briefly after the delivery, the windows had to be forced open, which in a room sealed for winter took considerable effort to revive her. She recovered, and she turned out to be a genuinely devoted mother, which surprised those who had expected the fashionable, entertainment-obsessed Dauphine to hand her children to nurses and think no more about them. Instead, she involved herself directly in their care to a degree that was unusual for a queen of her era. She oversaw their education, spent time with them daily, and formed real emotional attachments to all four of her children, the kind of attachments that would later, in the darkest years, become the central fact of her existence, the last thing worth protecting when everything else was gone. The longed-for son, Louis Joseph, arrived in 1781 and the celebrations were enormous. Marie Antoinette's position, which had always depended on this moment, was temporarily secured. A second son, Louis Charles, followed in 1785. He would become, after his brother's death, the child history would call Louis XVII. A second daughter, Sophie, was born in 1786 and died in infancy, a grief that Marie Antoinette felt deeply and that the public, by that point, was largely too hostile to acknowledge as human. The children were both her greatest joy and, as the revolution approached, her greatest vulnerability. She understood that they could be used against her, that threats to them were more effective than any other kind. The woman who had spent the first years of her marriage being criticized for frivolity became, in her role as mother, something that her enemies found considerably harder to caricature, and so largely chose to ignore. But the children were real, and her love for them was real, and in the years ahead, they would be almost the only real thing she had left. Of all the things that contributed to Marie Antoinette's downfall, the affair of the diamond necklace is perhaps the most extraordinary, because she was, genuinely, entirely innocent, and it destroyed her anyway. The necklace in question was a masterpiece of excess, a massive diamond choker containing over 640 diamonds, originally commissioned for Louis XV's mistress, and then abandoned when he died before it could be delivered, leaving the jewelers with an extraordinarily expensive problem on their hands. The necklace eventually became the center of a fraud scheme so convoluted, so operatically absurd, that it would be difficult to believe if the historical record were not so thoroughly documented. The scheme was organized by a woman named Jeanne de la Motte, a minor noblewoman of considerable intelligence and absolutely no scruples, who conceived a plan to acquire the necklace by convincing a credulous cardinal, Louis de Rohan, who desperately wanted to regain the Queen's favour after falling out with her years earlier, that Marie Antoinette wished to purchase the necklace secretly through an intermediary. She forged letters in the Queen's name. She arranged a late-night meeting in the gardens of Versailles in which a young woman who vaguely resembled the Queen played the role of Marie Antoinette. Spending approximately 2 minutes in the Cardinal's company before the encounter was interrupted, the Cardinal, astonishingly, was convinced. He agreed to act as go-between, signing for the necklace on the Queen's behalf. The jewelers, equally astonished that the matter had finally resolved itself, handed over an item worth roughly 1.5 million livres. Jeanne de la Motte promptly had the necklace broken up and sold, piece by piece, largely in London. When the jewelers presented the first installment of the payment to the Queen, and the Queen had no idea what they were talking about, the entire edifice collapsed simultaneously and very publicly. The scandal erupted in 1785 and consumed the court, the press, and the public imagination for years. Cardinal de Rohan was arrested and tried. Jeanne de la Motte was convicted and branded and imprisoned. Marie Antoinette, who had nothing to do with any of it, was nevertheless the figure around whom the story organized itself in the public mind, because the story required a queen willing to participate in secret schemes and frivolous expenditures, and she fit the pre-existing image perfectly. The damage was irreparable. Even people who understood she was innocent, and there were many, found the scandal confirming in some vaguer sense. This was the kind of thing that happened around her, the kind of story that attached itself to her name. The necklace became a symbol not of her innocence but of her excess, and the distinction was quickly lost in the noise. In the court of public opinion, which was the court that mattered by 1785, she was convicted before the trial began. By the mid-1780s, Marie Antoinette had acquired a nickname among the people of France that tells you almost everything you need to know about where things were heading: Madame Deficit. It was a sharp, simple, devastating piece of political shorthand, a woman whose personal extravagance was, in the public imagination, directly responsible for the financial ruin of the kingdom. The reality was considerably more complicated, as realities tend to be, but complicated realities do not make for good pamphlets. And France in the 1780s ran on pamphlets. France's financial crisis was structural, historic, and in many ways inevitable. The country had been spending beyond its means for generations, on wars, on court expenditures, on a tax system so riddled with exemptions for the nobility and clergy that the burden fell almost entirely on those least able to bear it. The American Revolution, which France had bankrolled in considerable part as an opportunity to weaken Britain, had been a diplomatic triumph and a financial catastrophe. The interest on the national debt was consuming an increasing proportion of royal revenue, and the various attempts to reform the tax system had been blocked, repeatedly and effectively, by the very nobles who would have had to pay. None of this was Marie Antoinette's doing. Her personal expenditures, while genuinely extravagant, were a rounding error in the context of French state finances. The gambling debts, the gowns, the Petit Trianon, the Hameau, all of it combined, would not have made a measurable difference to a debt that had been accumulating for decades before she arrived in France. But she was visible in a way that structural fiscal policy was not, and visible excess in a time of widespread suffering has a political weight that bears no relationship to its actual economic significance. The gap between her life and the lives of ordinary French people was not new. It had always existed, but by the 1780s, enough people had the education and the access to information to perceive it clearly, and the vocabulary, supplied by Enlightenment philosophy, to articulate why it was not simply unfortunate but wrong. A queen who spent more on a single gown than a working family earned in a year was no longer just a fact of life. She was an argument. She was evidence. She was Madame Deficit, and the name stuck. Her genuine attempts at economy, and there were some, particularly in the later 1780s, when she became more aware of how she was perceived, came too late and were too limited to change the image that had already solidified. She reduced her dress orders. She dismissed some of her household staff. She made visible gestures of simplicity. The pamphlets ignored these gestures entirely, because they did not fit the story, and by this point the story was more powerful than any fact that might complicate it. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was already in. In the years leading up to the Revolution, Marie Antoinette became the target of one of the most sustained, vicious, and frankly inventive campaigns of printed character assassination in European history. The pamphlets, libels as they were called, were cheap, anonymous, widely circulated, and absolutely unsparing. They accused her of adultery, of same-sex affairs, of spending the treasury on gambling debts and jewels, of writing treasonous letters to Austria, of hating France, of conspiring against the king, and of acts too graphic to be reprinted in anything claiming to be a respectable document. The libels existed in a grey zone of French law that made them extremely difficult to suppress. They were printed clandestinely, often outside France, in London, in Amsterdam, in Geneva, and smuggled across the border in quantities that made confiscation impossible. The police tried. They seized pamphlets, arrested distributors, tracked printing operations. For every one they stopped, 3 more appeared. The market for this material was large and enthusiastic, because it offered something that polite society's official channels did not. The pleasure of seeing the most powerful woman in France described in terms that stripped away every shred of dignity and authority. The image constructed by the libels bore almost no relationship to the actual person. The real Marie Antoinette was, by the 1780s, a woman whose life had been considerably sobered by experience, by the diamond necklace scandal, by the growing hostility of the public, by a deepening concern for her children and for a political situation she could see deteriorating. The Marie Antoinette of the libels was a cartoon monster, insatiable, treacherous, foreign, corrupt. The Austrian woman who was bleeding France dry while plotting with her Habsburg relatives to destroy French liberty. The foreign origin was crucial. L'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, was what the most hostile pamphlets called her, and the syllables were arranged to also suggest something cruder in French, a linguistic cruelty that required no translation. Her Austrianness, which had always been a mild liability, became under this pressure a genuine political vulnerability. Every real or rumoured communication with Vienna was evidence of treason. Every Austrian interest she was perceived to favour was evidence that she had never truly been French at all. She was aware of the pamphlets. It would have been impossible not to be. She did not, as far as the historical record shows, fully understand the extent to which they had shaped public opinion until it was far too late to address it. The world outside the gates of Versailles, the world in which her image was being systematically destroyed, was not directly visible from inside the palace. By the time she understood what had been done to her reputation, the damage was complete, and the revolution that would use that reputation against her was already beginning. Marie Antoinette was, in a very real sense, the first modern celebrity, which is to say, she was the first person to experience the particular horror of being simultaneously adored and despised by millions of people who had never met her, based almost entirely on an image constructed by others and distributed without her consent. Fashion plates depicting her latest gowns circulated across Europe within weeks of her wearing them. Women in Paris and London copied her hairstyles. Her taste in fabrics influenced what the textile merchants of Lyon produced. She was the most written about, painted, and discussed woman in the Western world, and almost none of it was within her control. The machinery that produced this celebrity was the 18th century's version of a media ecosystem: printmakers, engravers, booksellers, pamphlet writers, gossip columnists in the nascent newspapers, portrait painters whose work was reproduced in editions that reached across national borders. It was not centrally organized. There was no single entity managing the image of the Queen of France, but it functioned with remarkable efficiency, and it was entirely capable of amplifying both admiration and hostility to a scale that had not previously been possible. In the early years of her reign, the machinery worked in her favour. Portrait prints showed a beautiful young queen, fashionably dressed, graceful, a credit to her position. Fashion plates spread Versailles taste across Europe. Composers dedicated works to her. Poets wrote in her praise. She was a cultural phenomenon as much as a political figure, and the culture initially was enthusiastic. The problem, the structural, inescapable problem, was that the same machinery that built the image could dismantle it, and once the pamphlet writers and the satirical printmakers got hold of her, the process ran in the other direction with equal efficiency. She had almost no tools to respond. The 18th century did not have public relations in any recognizable sense. A queen could not give an interview, could not issue a statement, could not present herself directly to the public in a way that bypassed the intermediaries who were busy constructing a version of her that bore no relation to reality. She could commission portraits, she did, including the famous painting by Vigée Lebrun that showed her with her children, a deliberate attempt to present the maternal, domestic side of her that the pamphlets were busy denying. The portrait worked, for those who saw it, but the pamphlets reached further. What she experienced was the fundamental asymmetry of celebrity. The image, once it has escaped into the world, no longer belongs to the person it depicts. The Marie Antoinette who existed in the collective French imagination by the late 1780s was a character, a construction, assembled from equal parts genuine behaviour, deliberate distortion, political grievance, and the specific resentments of a society under enormous pressure looking for somewhere to direct them. That she happened to be real, and to live inside this image, and to suffer its consequences in the most direct possible terms, was not something the machinery considered relevant. By 1789, the world outside the gates of Versailles had changed in ways that the court inside had spent years refusing to acknowledge. France was broke. The harvests of 1788 had failed catastrophically, and the winter that followed was one of the coldest in living memory. Bread prices had climbed to the point where ordinary families were spending the majority of their income simply on the most basic food. Meanwhile, the convening of the Estates General, the first meeting of France's representative body in 175 years, was releasing political energy that had been building for decades, and it was not going to be quietly managed back into submission. The Estates General met at Versailles in May of 1789, and the atmosphere was unlike anything the palace had previously contained. Representatives of the Third Estate, the commoners, the lawyers, the merchants, the ordinary people who made up the vast majority of France and paid the vast majority of its taxes, arrived with notebooks full of grievances and a determination to be heard that the court had not anticipated and did not know how to process. They had been asked to come and discuss the financial crisis. They had come to discuss something considerably larger. Marie Antoinette's position at this moment was deeply complicated. She was not ignorant of the crisis. She had been receiving reports, reading dispatches, watching her husband's ministers come and go with increasing frequency as each attempt at reform collapsed. But Versailles was a world with its own gravity, and the gravity of Versailles pulled everything toward the centre, toward ceremony, toward protocol, toward the assumption that the machinery of the monarchy would continue to function because it always had. Breaking free of that gravity required an imaginative leap that the court was constitutionally unable to make. She was also, by 1789, genuinely unpopular in ways that went beyond the pamphlets. The diamond necklace scandal had not been forgotten. The years of conspicuous expenditure had not been forgotten. Her Austrian origin, which the libelles had worked so hard to weaponize, made her an easy symbol for everything that was foreign, excessive, and indifferent about the regime. When the Estates General met and the Third Estate began asserting itself, she was not its target. The system was the target, but she was its face, the most visible human embodiment of everything the reformers were arguing against. The weeks between May and July of 1789 moved with the disorienting speed of events that had been building for years, and then accelerate beyond anyone's ability to steer them. The Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. The king locked them out of their meeting hall. They reconvened on a nearby tennis court and swore not to disperse until France had a constitution. Louis hesitated, reversed himself, appeared to concede, appeared to resist, and gave the impression of a man trying to drive in 4 directions simultaneously. On July 14th, a Paris mob stormed the Bastille prison, more symbol than fortress by that point, but a symbol of enormous power, and the world changed. Marie Antoinette, inside Versailles, received the news with what witnesses described as outward composure and inward terror. The terror was justified. The Bastille's fall was not an event that could be walked back, negotiated around, or absorbed by the machinery of the old regime. Something had broken that could not be repaired. The court that had spent a century turning its back on the rest of France was about to discover that the rest of France had turned to face it, and the expression on its face was not friendly. On October 5th, 1789, a group of market women in Paris, furious about bread prices and the perceived indifference of the royal family, began marching toward Versailles. What started as a few hundred women with pikes and kitchen tools grew, as they marched the 12 miles through the rain, into a procession of several thousand people, joined by members of the National Guard and various radicals, all of them converging on the palace that had come to represent, in the most literal possible sense, everything that was wrong with France. By the time they arrived at the gates of Versailles, any illusion that the revolution was happening somewhere else, somewhere abstract and distant, was over. Marie Antoinette was at the Petit Trianon when word reached her. She returned to the main palace, and the court spent a tense evening listening to the noise of the crowd outside the gates, the chanting, the drumming, the sound of several thousand furious people who had walked 12 miles in the rain and were not inclined to be patient. The National Guard, under Lafayette, arrived and established some degree of order, and the night settled into an uneasy, watchful quiet. The court believed, hoped, that the worst was over. In the early hours of October 6th, it was not over. a group within the crowd found an unguarded entrance to the palace and broke through, making their way toward the Queen's apartments. The guards at her door were attacked. Marie Antoinette, woken by the sound, fled through a connecting passage to the king's apartments in her nightgown, her hair unbound, having escaped with minutes to spare. The crowd reached her rooms and found them empty. They slashed her bed with pikes. What followed was one of the most dramatic scenes of the entire revolution. As morning came and the crowd filled the palace courtyard, Louis appeared on the balcony and announced that the royal family would move to Paris. It was not quite a capitulation. It was framed as a gesture of closeness to his people, but it was understood by everyone present as exactly what it was. The king had no choice. The crowd was in the palace. The palace was no longer safe. Versailles, the great machine that had controlled French politics for a century, was finished as a seat of power. Marie Antoinette also appeared on the balcony, alone, in a moment that contemporaries described with something very close to awe. She had been told that the crowd was specifically hostile to her, that there were people below who wanted her dead. She stepped forward anyway. The children who had been with her stepped back at her request, and she stood alone before the crowd and made a deep, formal bow. There was a moment of silence. Then, reportedly, cheers. It was the last time the crowd would cheer her. The journey to Paris that afternoon was grotesque. The royal carriage surrounded by the crowd, heads of the palace guards who had been killed that morning, mounted on pikes and carried alongside the procession. The family rode in silence for the most part. The children kept close, the king staring ahead. Marie Antoinette, who had fled her own bedroom that morning, who had heard the sound of her door being attacked, who had just watched her home of 19 years disappear behind her, sat and did not break. The composure she maintained that day, and in the days immediately following, is one of the least contested facts about her character. Whatever else she was not a coward. In the aftermath of the Women's March, the royal family was effectively escorted to Paris under conditions that everyone politely agreed to call a voluntary relocation, and everyone privately understood to be nothing of the sort. The Tuileries Palace, a royal residence in the heart of the city, became their new home, and it was a deeply strange, deeply uncomfortable existence. After Versailles, 300 rooms, vast gardens, an entire artificial world constructed around the business of being royal, the Tuileries felt cramped, exposed, and uncomfortably real. The Tuileries had not been used as a primary royal residence for decades, and it showed. The apartments were dusty, the staff unprepared, the arrangements hastily assembled for a family who had arrived under circumstances no one had planned for. The children were settled into rooms that were adequate, but nothing more. Marie Antoinette organized what she could, because organization was something to do, and doing things was better than thinking too clearly about what had just happened. Paris itself was a different kind of enclosure than Versailles. At Versailles, the observation had been courtly, the thousand eyes of the nobility, watching for advantage, cataloguing behavior for future reference. In Paris, the observation was popular, the city watching the palace from outside, the crowd that gathered in the Tuileries gardens to stare at the royal family taking the air, the newspapers reporting on every visible movement. The family could be seen, they could be monitored. The sense of being watched did not diminish, it changed character, becoming something raw and more immediately threatening. Louis attempted to engage with the new political reality. He swore an oath to the new constitution, appeared in public wearing the revolutionary tricolour, tried to present himself as a constitutional monarch, sincerely committed to the new order. Some of this was genuine, he was not without adaptability, and some of it was performance. The performance of a man who understood that performance was currently all that stood between his family and something much worse. The National Assembly, which had followed the court to Paris, watched him with the particular suspicion of people who have won a significant argument and are not entirely sure the other party has accepted the result. Marie Antoinette's experience of the Tuileries years was one of progressive constriction. The world that had always been large, the palace, the gardens, the court, the endless ceremony and entertainment, contracted. She could not go to the Petit Trianon. She could not go to the theatre without the crowd's reaction to her presence, becoming an event in itself, a political statement made by cheers or silence or occasional hostile shouts. She began corresponding secretly with foreign courts, with her brother the emperor, with various European monarchs, in coded letters carried by trusted intermediaries, urging intervention, urging support, watching the situation deteriorate while hoping that someone from outside would arrive to stop it. This correspondence was, from a purely political standpoint, reasonable. She was a Habsburg princess as much as a French queen, and she had family and resources outside France that might genuinely help. From the perspective of the revolution and its increasingly suspicious leadership, it was treason. The line between those two interpretations was the line between survival and disaster, and she was walking it every day. In June of 1791, the royal family attempted to flee France. What had been months of careful planning, a route mapped out, disguises arranged, a large Berline carriage specially modified to carry the family in relative comfort, came down, in the end, to a series of small catastrophes strung together with the particular cruelty of bad timing. They left the Tuileries in the middle of the night, dressed as servants, sneaking out through a side door. The plan nearly worked. It failed for reasons that are, in retrospect, almost tragicomically mundane. A delay at a relay station, a suspicious postmaster, a man who recognized the king's profile from his image on a coin. The escape plan had been organized primarily by Count Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman who was among Marie Antoinette's closest friends, and, by most historical assessments, something more than that. Fersen arranged the carriage, the route, the relay horses, the forged travel documents. The plan was to reach the northeastern border, where royalist troops under the command of the Marquis de Bouillé were waiting to receive them. From there, with military protection, Louis could negotiate from a position of something other than complete vulnerability. The first hours went better than expected. The family got out of the Tuileries undetected, no small feat given the level of surveillance they were under. The carriage made reasonable progress through the night and into the following day. Then the delays began. A relay of horses was not where it should have been. Time was lost. The troops who were supposed to be waiting at various points along the route, finding the carriage overdue, assumed the plan had been abandoned and dispersed. By the time the Berline reached Varennes, it was travelling without military escort through territory where people were awake, alert, and suspicious. A postmaster named Drouet recognized the king, the profile on the coin, the unhelpful specificity of a face stamped on currency, and raised the alarm. The family was stopped at Varennes, identified, and held while messengers rode to Paris. The National Assembly sent representatives to escort them back. The return journey took 3 days, through towns where the crowds lined the road in silence. Not the silence of respect, but the silence of people who have made a decision and are watching it be confirmed. The National Guard rode alongside the carriage with their muskets reversed, a gesture indicating neither ceremony nor honour. The flight to Varennes was the moment from which recovery became impossible. Before it, the king's commitment to the constitutional order could be presented as genuine, however implausibly. After it, the pretense was gone. He had tried to leave. He had been caught. Every assurance he gave from that point forward was understood by everyone, including himself, to be the assurance of a man with no alternatives. Marie Antoinette, for her part, returned to the Tuileries with her hair reported to have turned noticeably whiter during the ordeal. She was 35 years old. She looked, observers noted, considerably older. On August 10th, 1792, an armed mob stormed the Tuileries Palace. The royal family had already fled to the nearby Legislative Assembly for protection, but protection was a relative concept by this point. The Swiss Guard, the king's personal bodyguard, was massacred. The palace was ransacked, and the constitutional monarchy that had seemed, just a year earlier, like a possible compromise between the old world and the new, collapsed. Louis XVI was suspended from his functions, which was the revolutionary government's polite way of saying that the king was no longer king in any meaningful sense, and that the family was now prisoners. The months between the flight to Varennes and the 10th of August had been a steady, accelerating deterioration. War had been declared against Austria and Prussia in the spring, and the war was going badly. Foreign armies were advancing toward Paris. The revolutionary government, increasingly dominated by its most radical elements, was looking for enemies within: traitors, counter-revolutionaries, people conspiring with the foreign powers that were trying to restore the monarchy. The royal family were the most obvious candidates, being both literally foreign and literally the monarchy, and the government's ability or willingness to protect them was declining with every military setback. Marie Antoinette understood what was happening with a clarity that Louis, whose temperament inclined toward hoping things would improve, seems to have struggled to match. Her secret correspondence with Austria had continued. She had been passing information about French military plans, a fact that historians have confirmed and that constitutes, by any reasonable definition, treason against France, though the reasonable definition is complicated by the question of what loyalty she owed a country that was in the process of killing her. The correspondence was known, or suspected, by the revolutionary leadership, and it made her position genuinely dangerous in a way that went beyond unpopularity. On the night of August 9th, the tocsin, the alarm bell, rang across Paris. Armed sections of the city marched on the Tuileries. The royal family was woken and hustled to a small room in the Assembly building, where they spent the day sitting in a reporter's box, listening to the sound of the Swiss Guard being killed outside, waiting to find out what their fate would be. The children were with them. Marie Antoinette sat and listened to the sounds, and did not break, which was by this point almost a habit. When the session ended and the family was taken to the temple, the world they had known was gone completely. The palace was destroyed. The court was dissolved. The guards who surrounded them now were not the ceremonial attendants of royalty, but the armed representatives of a government that had not yet decided what to do with them, and the options under discussion were not comfortable. The Queen of France sat in a medieval tower and began the work of surviving what came next, one day at a time, for as long as there were days left. The royal family was taken to the Temple, a medieval fortress in Paris that had been converted into a prison, and it was here that Marie Antoinette spent some of the most harrowing months of her life. The Temple was not a dungeon. It had rooms, furniture, books, and a courtyard where the family could walk, but it was unmistakably a prison, and everyone inside knew that their situation was deteriorating in ways that had only one possible direction. Louis was separated from his family within months of their arrival, and tried by the National Convention in December. Life in the Temple had a terrible domesticity to it. Meals at regular hours, reading, needlework, lessons for the children, walks in the courtyard under the eyes of guards who were sometimes civil and sometimes deliberately cruel. Marie Antoinette organized the days with the same instinct for structure that she had always had, because structure was a form of control, and control was the one thing she could still exercise over any part of her existence. She taught her son geography. She read. She kept herself and the children as composed as circumstances allowed, which required more effort with every passing week. The guards changed regularly, some hostile, some merely indifferent, occasionally one who showed a small and risky kindness, an extra candle, a book left within reach, a piece of news whispered when no one else was listening. She noticed these things and was grateful for them with a depth that would have been incomprehensible to the woman who had once sent back a gown because the colour was insufficiently fashionable. The distance between Versailles and the Temple was not just geographical. Louis's trial began in December and was brief, in the way that trials whose verdict is predetermined tend to be brief. He was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. He was executed on January 21st, 1793. Marie Antoinette was not permitted to attend the trial or to see him properly before his death. She received him briefly, a final meeting, in the presence of guards, with the children. What was said has not been fully recorded. Some things were too private, even for the relentless documentation of the revolution. After Louise's death, her situation darkened further. She was now a widow, a prisoner, and a woman whose fate was being discussed by a government that was simultaneously fighting a war, managing a revolution, and deciding how useful she might be as a bargaining chip, or as an example. Her son, Louis Charles, was taken from her in July of 1793, removed to a separate part of the temple to be raised by a revolutionary tutor, and it was hoped, educated out of his royalism. The separation destroyed something in her that the rest of it had not. She wept for hours, audibly, and then she stopped and did not weep again where anyone could see. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in what is now the Place de la Concorde. Marie Antoinette was not permitted to see him before his death, except for a final brief meeting with the children. She was 37 years old, a widow, a prisoner, and the mother of a young son who was now, at least in the eyes of the remaining royalists of Europe, King Louis XVII, a title that meant absolutely nothing within the walls of the temple, where he remained locked away from his mother, increasingly used as a tool by his captors. The morning of January 21st was bitterly cold. Louis had spent the previous evening with his confessor and had been permitted a final meeting with his family. The records of those who observed it describe a scene of extraordinary grief, the children weeping, Marie Antoinette struggling to maintain composure, Louis attempting to comfort everyone with a steadiness that the observers found both admirable and almost unbearable to witness. He asked that she not be told the exact hour of the execution. She found out anyway. She heard the cannon fire that signalled the execution had been carried out. She was in the temple with her children, in the rooms they had shared for months, and she heard the sound, and she knew what it meant. What she did in the hours immediately following is not thoroughly documented. The guards' records for that day are brief and factual, noting meals delivered and windows checked. What she felt is not recorded at all, because she was not the kind of woman who performed her private grief for an audience, even an audience of hostile strangers with notebooks. In the weeks that followed, she entered a period of mourning that was private and profound and conducted under conditions of deliberate indignity. The guards who brought her meals sometimes made a point of not addressing her as queen. The newspapers outside the prison walls were full of celebrations of the execution and contemptuous references to the widow Capet, which was how the revolutionary government now officially designated her. She was no longer a queen, she was a prisoner with a number and a case pending. What strikes observers of this period, both contemporary and historical, is the extraordinary degree to which she held herself together. She had resources, faith, stubbornness, genuine love for her children that gave her a reason to keep going, but the external circumstances were relentlessly designed to strip away dignity, and she did not let them. She continued the children's lessons. She continued to dress with whatever care was possible given the limitations of temple life. She continued to behave like a queen, even when there was no kingdom left, and no one was watching except guards who wrote reports for a government that wanted her dead. On October 14th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal to stand trial. She had been moved from the temple to the conciergerie, known as the antechamber of death, several months earlier, after a failed escape plot had made the authorities nervous. The trial lasted 2 days, and the charges against her ranged from the politically serious to the fabricated to the monstrous. The most infamous accusation came from a man who claimed she had sexually abused her own son, a charge so grotesque that even some revolutionaries were uncomfortable with it. The conciergerie was a different kind of imprisonment from the temple. Her cell was small, damp, and poorly lit, overlooked by guards who worked in shifts specifically to prevent her from sleeping for more than a few hours at a stretch. She was given the bare minimum of what was required: a bed, a chair, a table, basic food, and denied most other things. Her hair, which had been going grey since Varennes, had by this point turned entirely white. She was 37 years old and looked, by the accounts of those who saw her, significantly older. When she was brought into the courtroom, the observers noted her bearing. She was thin, pale, and visibly exhausted. But her posture was exact, and her expression was composed in the particular way that composed expressions are composed when they are the product of enormous effort rather than ease. She sat and listened to the charges and answered the questions put to her with a precision and clarity that the court had perhaps not fully anticipated. She had not been broken. She was going to be very difficult to break in public, which was inconvenient for a tribunal that needed the proceedings to look like justice. The charges covered everything: sending money to Austria, conspiring with foreign powers, leading the king astray, corrupting the morals of the court. She answered each with the same measured directness, denying what was false, acknowledging what was true, never becoming hysterical, never begging. The prosecutors pushed harder. The accusations escalated. When the accusation about her son was made, delivered by a man named Hébert, stated in open court with the explicit intention of destroying what remained of her dignity, there was a pause. She turned to face the women in the public gallery and said that nature itself recoiled from such an accusation and that she appealed to every mother present. There was a reaction in the room, some silence, some discomfort, the particular discomfort of people who have been briefly reminded of their own humanity. It was the single most powerful moment of the trial, and it changed nothing. The verdict was not in doubt. It had not been in doubt since the day she was transferred to the conciergerie. The trial was a performance, and she gave a better performance than the prosecution, and it made no difference at all. On the morning of October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette woke in her cell at the conciergerie before dawn. The execution was scheduled for midday, but there was much to be done, and she attended to it with a composure that her jailers and the few witnesses present would later describe with something very close to awe. She wrote a final letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, a letter that was confiscated by the authorities and not delivered, and which survived to become one of the most poignant documents of the entire revolutionary period. In it, she spoke of her children, of her faith, and of her acceptance of what was coming. The letter runs to several pages and is written without crossings out or corrections, in a clear hand, as though she had composed it entirely in her head before setting pen to paper and needed only to transcribe it. She writes of her love for her children, Louis Charles, from whom she had been separated and whom she would not see again, and Marie-Thérèse, who would eventually survive and live a long life in exile. She asks that they be taught that their mother died thinking of them, and that her greatest grief was leaving them. She asks forgiveness for anyone she may have hurt. She forgives, explicitly and completely, those who have destroyed her. She dressed carefully for the last time. The gown was white. Some accounts say muslin. Some say a simple chemise, not the elaborate silks of Versailles, but something plain and deliberate. White was the colour of royal mourning in France. Whether she chose it consciously as a last statement of identity or simply because it was what was available, the effect was significant. She had her hair cut short at the nape of her neck by the executioner's assistant, the standard preparation for the guillotine, a practical intimacy that she submitted to without comment. The journey through the streets of Paris took over an hour. At Versailles, she had always travelled in a closed carriage. Today she rode in an open cart, the tumbril, seated upright, her hands bound behind her, passing through streets lined with people. Some watched in silence, some shouted, some wept. She looked forward and did not perform either distress or defiance, which was itself a kind of performance, though perhaps the most authentic one available to her. She was seen by thousands of people who had never seen her before and would describe what they saw for the rest of their lives. At the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and apologized. The apology has become famous, the last recorded words of a queen who had been accused of every crime imaginable, and what she said at the very end was, "Pardon, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." It is either the most Marie Antoinette thing she ever did, or a detail too perfectly symbolic to be entirely trusted. Either way, history has kept it. More than 200 years after her death, Marie Antoinette remains one of the most debated, most reinterpreted, and most written about women in European history, which is itself a kind of irony, given that so much of her actual life was spent being written about by people who had no interest in accuracy. The image that survived her, the cake, the wigs, the diamonds, the indifference is. Historians have spent decades arguing, substantially a fiction, a caricature assembled from propaganda, grievance, and the particular need of a revolution to have a villain who deserves what is coming to her. The real woman was something considerably more complicated. And the cake line, first of all, was almost certainly not hers. The phrase, "let them eat cake," appears in Rousseau's Confessions attributed to a great princess, written when Marie Antoinette was approximately 10 years old and had not yet left Austria. It was applied to her retroactively by a historical imagination that found it too perfectly fitting to resist. This is how legends work. They attach themselves to the person who can carry them most efficiently, regardless of whether that person actually said the thing, or did the thing, or even knew the thing existed. What she actually was, stripped of the legend, is a woman who was handed an impossible situation at an impossibly young age and managed it with varying degrees of success and failure. She was genuinely frivolous in her early years at Versailles. The expenditure was real, the gambling was real, the fashion was extravagant in ways that were politically damaging regardless of their economic insignificance. She was also, particularly in her later years, genuinely brave, genuinely loving, and possessed of a dignity under pressure that her worst enemies acknowledged even while working to destroy her. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse survived the revolution and the temple and lived until 1851, outlasting almost everyone who had participated in her mother's destruction. Her son Louis-Charles died in the temple in 1795 at 10 years old of neglect and illness, a fact that sits in the historical record with a particular weight. The child she had fought so hard to protect, separated from her by a government that understood exactly how much the separation would hurt her, died alone in a prison cell 2 years after her own execution. Her rehabilitation began almost immediately after the revolution ended and has continued in various forms ever since. Royalists mourned her as a martyr. Feminists reclaimed her as a woman destroyed by a system that demanded everything of her and forgave her nothing. Fashion historians study her influence on European style. Psychologists analyze her coping mechanisms. Filmmakers return to her story every generation, finding new angles, new sympathies, new critiques. She has been a symbol of excess, a symbol of victimhood, a symbol of feminine power, and a symbol of its limits, sometimes in the same decade. What she was, in the end, was a human being, a specific, complicated, flawed, brave, frightened, loving human being who lived through one of the most extreme experiences that a human being in her era could have lived through, and who faced the end of it with a grace that the 2 centuries since have not been able to stop talking about. The argument about who she really was will continue for as long as people are interested in the question of what it costs to be a woman living at the intersection of power, image, and history's need for a story. Which is to say, it will continue for quite some time. At the centre of Marie Antoinette's life at Versailles, behind the ceremonies and the gowns and the endless performance of queenship, was a hunger for something the palace was structurally incapable of providing. Genuine human connection. She was surrounded at all times by hundreds of people, and she was profoundly, chronically lonely. The friendships she formed in response to that loneliness were the warmest thing about her life at court, and some of the most politically costly decisions she ever made. The Princess de Lamballe was the first great friendship, and in many ways the purest. Marie-Louise of Savoy was gentle, loyal, and entirely without personal ambition, a rarity at Versailles so extraordinary that Marie Antoinette recognized it immediately and held on to it fiercely. She elevated the princess to the position of superintendent of the Queen's household, a role that came with significant financial benefits, and the court noted the favoritism with its customary mixture of envy and commentary. The friendship was genuine on both sides. When the revolution came and the princess had every opportunity to leave France and save herself, she returned from England to be with the Queen. It was a decision that cost her life. She was murdered by a Paris mob in September of 1792, her death deliberately brutal, her head paraded on a pike past the windows of the temple where Marie Antoinette was imprisoned. The Queen collapsed when she saw it. Of all the horrors of those years, This one broke through her composure completely. The friendship with the Comtesse de Polignac was more complicated and more damaging. Yolande de Polignac was charming, beautiful, and possessed of a large extended family with an apparently bottomless appetite for royal patronage. Marie Antoinette adored her. The feeling appears to have been genuine, and through that adoration, the Polignac family accumulated titles, appointments, pensions, and properties at a rate that the court and eventually the public found impossible to ignore. When the libels listed the Queen's crimes, the enrichment of the Polignac circle featured prominently. When Yolande de Polignac left France at the start of the Revolution, an entirely sensible decision for her own survival, Marie Antoinette reportedly provided money for her escape and said goodbye with real grief. The friendship had cost her enormously in public trust and given her, in return, something that the accounts of those years suggest she valued enormously: a person she could talk to. There were other friendships, other loyalties. Count Axel von Fersen, the Swedish nobleman who organized the flight to Varennes, was almost certainly more than a friend, though the precise nature of their relationship remains one of the genuinely contested questions of the period. What is clear is that he was devoted to her in ways that went well beyond political calculation, that he risked his own safety repeatedly on her behalf, and that his surviving correspondence with her, some of it in code, some of the most personal passages deliberately obscured by one or both of them, suggests an intimacy that was real, regardless of its exact nature. What all these relationships reveal, taken together, is a woman who was capable of deep loyalty and deep feeling, who gave her trust rarely but completely, who held on to the people she loved with a tenacity that the court found incomprehensible and history has found consistently moving. Versailles was a machine for producing isolation dressed up as company, and she fought against that isolation the only way available to her, by loving specific people, fiercely and at considerable cost, in a world that punished feeling as a form of weakness. The friendships that saved her sanity were real, that they also contributed to her destruction, is one of the more painful ironies of a life that was not short on them. There is a version of Marie Antoinette that history has largely forgotten, crowded out by the wigs and the diamonds and the revolution. The version that sat at the harpsichord in the early morning before the court was awake, playing for no one, for the simple reason that she loved it. Music was not, for her, a performance or a social accomplishment to be displayed at dinner. It was the one place in her life where the audience dissolved and the thing itself remained, and she returned to it throughout her life with a consistency that says more about who she actually was than almost anything else in the record. She had been taught by Gluck himself, Christoph Willibald Gluck, one of the most significant composers of the 18th century, who had been her music teacher in Vienna and who followed her career from afar with what appears to have been genuine affection. When he came to Paris in the 1770s, and his operas became the centre of one of the era's great aesthetic controversies, the Gluckists versus the Piccinists, a musical argument that consumed Parisian intellectual life with an intensity that seems disproportionate until you remember that Paris in this period argued about everything with maximum intensity. Marie Antoinette was openly in Gluck's corner. It was not a particularly diplomatic position, but it was an honest one, and honesty about aesthetic preferences was something she was more comfortable with than honesty about political ones. The theatre at the Petit Trianon was her creation and her delight. She had it built specifically for private theatricals, performances organised by her inner circle, rehearsed over weeks, performed for invited guests in an atmosphere that was the opposite of the formal theatrical performances at Versailles proper. She performed herself, taking singing roles, speaking roles, comic roles that required her to be undignified in ways that court protocol would never have permitted in a public setting. The accounts of people who attended these performances describe something that is surprisingly affecting. A woman who was genuinely funny, genuinely musical, genuinely at ease in a way that the public Marie Antoinette almost never was. The court disapproved. The idea of the Queen performing on a stage, even a private one, even for a controlled audience, was considered inappropriate in ways that the more traditional members of the nobility articulated at length. A queen was not an actress. Performing implied a kind of self-display that was incompatible with royal dignity, a confusion of categories that made serious people uncomfortable. Marie Antoinette performed anyway, because the Petit Trianon was the one place where serious people's discomfort was not her primary concern. In the temple, in the years of imprisonment, music became something different, not a pleasure but a ghost, a memory of a life that no longer existed. There was no harpsichord in her cell at the conciergerie. There were no theatricals in the temple courtyard. But the people who observed her in those years noted that she sometimes hummed quietly to herself, alone, in the way that people do when the music is internal and the audience is gone and the playing is simply for the sake of the sound. It is one of the smallest details in the historical record of those years, and one of the most human. The queen who had danced at Versailles and played for Gluck and performed comedy at the Petit Trianon, sitting in a cold cell, humming something to herself in the dark. The inner life does not stop simply because the outer one has been taken away. If you want to understand Marie Antoinette, not the caricature, not the symbol, not the historical argument, but the actual person who lived through the actual events. The place to start is not the Hall of Mirrors, or the diamond necklace, or the scaffold. It is the children. 4 of them, born between 1778 and 1786. Each one wanted with a depth of feeling that the public record of her reign almost entirely obscures behind the more photogenic story of the fashion and the frivolity. The children were the realest thing in her life. They were also, in the end, the most effective weapon her enemies had against her. Marie-Thérèse, the eldest, was born in December of 1778 after 7 years of anxious waiting. And Marie Antoinette's response to her arrival was immediate and total. She refused, against the expectations of the court, to hand the infant entirely to wet nurses and governesses in the manner traditional for royal mothers of her era. She visited the nursery daily. She involved herself in the details of the children's care in ways that her own mother, who had handed 16 children largely to staff, would have found unusual. The court found it touching, and then, when it became inconvenient to find it touching, forgot about it entirely. Louis-Joseph, the Dauphin, arrived in 1781 and was the child whose birth secured her position in the way that Marie-Thérèse, despite being loved equally, had not. A male heir was what France had been waiting for, and the celebrations were enormous. Fireworks, public festivals, an amnesty for prisoners, the particular extravagance of a court that knew how to celebrate when it chose to. Marie Antoinette was finally, after 11 years in France, what she had been sent there to be. It lasted 7 years. Louis-Joseph was a delicate child who became a seriously ill one, and he died in June of 1789, at 7 years old, of tuberculosis of the spine. In the opening weeks of the Revolution, while his parents were consumed by a political crisis that left almost no space for private grief, his mother sat with him as he died and then attended to the Estates General because there was no alternative. The grief was real, and it was buried because it had to be. Louis Charles, the second son, was 4 years old when the revolution began and 8 when he was taken from his mother in the Temple. The separation was deliberate and purposeful. The revolutionary government wanted to educate him as a Republican citizen, and they understood, with the particular coldness of people who have thought carefully about how to cause maximum suffering, that removing him from his mother was the most effective instrument available. He was placed in the care of a cobbler named Simon, who was instructed to erase whatever the Queen had taught him. The reports of what followed are deeply unpleasant reading. He died in the Temple in June of 1795, 2 years after his mother's execution, of conditions that amounted to deliberate neglect. He was 10 years old. Marie-Thérèse survived. She was released from the Temple in December of 1795, exchanged for French prisoners held by Austria, and lived out a long life in exile, eventually dying in 1851. She was known throughout her adult life as Madame Royale, and later as the Duchess of Angoulême, and she was by all accounts a serious, sorrowful woman who carried what had happened to her family with a weight that never entirely lifted. She was the only one of Marie Antoinette's children to live to old age. She was the part of her mother that survived. So here you are, somewhere in the dark, at the end of Marie Antoinette's story. You have travelled a long way tonight, from the marble corridors of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, where a 15th child was being quietly prepared for a destiny she had no part in choosing, through the gilded machinery of Versailles, where 3,000 people watched a young woman get dressed every morning and called it ceremony, through the diamond necklace and the pamphlets and the wigs and the hamo and the slow, grinding collapse of a world that had always been more fragile than it looked. You have watched a 14-year-old girl cross a border and hand over her dog and her language and her name and become something the world needed her to be. You have watched her make mistakes, real ones, costly ones, the kind that come from being raised in a palace and never quite understanding that the world outside it was running out of patience. You have watched her be blamed for things she did not do, and accused of things she could not have done, and tried in a court that had already written the verdict before she opened her mouth. And you have watched her, at the very end, step onto a scaffold in a white dress with her hands bound and her hair cut short, and apologize for stepping on someone's foot. She was not a saint. History has no obligation to make her one, and she would probably have found the attempt slightly ridiculous. She was vain in her early years. She was careless with money in ways that had consequences she did not fully reckon with. She was a woman of her world and her class and her century, with all the limitations those things imposed on what she was capable of seeing and understanding. But she was also a woman who loved her children with everything she had, who sat in a cold cell and hummed to herself in the dark, who stepped onto a balcony when the crowd below wanted her dead and made a bow so composed and so complete that even people who hated her were briefly silenced, who wrote her last letter without a single correction, in a clear hand, at 4 a.m, thinking of her children. History tends to remember the wigs. It is less good at remembering the person inside them. The people of her time, the ordinary people, the ones who marched and shouted and suffered through a revolution that promised everything and delivered something considerably more complicated, they were not wrong to be angry. The system that produced Marie Antoinette, that built Versailles and starved the countryside to pay for it, that locked power inside a palace and called the arrangement divine, that system deserved everything that came for it. The tragedy is that the symbol and the person are not always the same thing, and history does not always take the time to notice the difference. So tonight, as you pull your blanket a little higher and let the darkness settle in around you, think for a moment about the girl who left Vienna at 14 and never went home again, about the queen who found her one private afternoon at the Petit Trianon and held on to it for as long as she could, about the mother who taught her children geography in a prison and hummed in a cell and wrote 4 pages without a single crossing out on the last night of her life. She lived in one of the most extreme versions of a very ordinary human experience, the experience of being seen without being known, of being famous without being understood, of having your story told by everyone except yourself. The world she came from is gone. The palace is a museum. The revolution that ended her life eventually ended itself. The diamond necklace was broken up and scattered, and its pieces are lost to history, which feels appropriate. But somewhere in the record, in the letters and the portraits and the accounts of people who were there, she is still present, still composing herself, still stepping forward, still making the bow. Sleep well,